One of the best remarks that was made to describe why the Conservative Party is so relevant was a quote from a novel people may have heard of, The Leopard, about Sicily in the 19th century, where somebody says to an Italian nobleman, if you want things to stay the same, things will have to change. So the Conservative Party has never been reactionary. The Labour Party's budget marks the Labour Party no longer Blair's New Labour. It is now high tax, high spend. The Tory Party, the Conservative Party now, is able and very willing to be seen as the party that would cut taxes as soon as it was able to do so. That would be its priority, not just an option.
This is The Capitalist, presented by CapEx.
Malcolm Rifkind, welcome to The Capitalist.
Thank you very much.
You said that you had changed your mind on the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, and that the UK needed to leave it in order to tackle the problem of illegal immigration. What made you change your mind?
Well, first may I say that my preference is not that we leave it irreversibly, but that we suspend that part of it which deals with migration issues, and we suspend it until the whole question of government control of migration policy has been resolved. Once that has happened, then the option must be there to resume full involvement in the convention. That is the easiest way to do it. It will invite the least criticism from those who dislike the decision, but it might also help get the policy successful. Your question was, why did I change my view? And it's essentially because I've always respected the European Convention of Human Rights. It was formed after the Second World War very much with British involvement. David Maxwell Fyfe, who became Lord Kilmuir, the Lord Chancellor, drafted a lot of it. And it was meant to prevent very nasty people in various European countries resuming the kind of awful events that happened under fascism and Nazism. The problem, as we all know now, is that like all these conventions, they have to be interpreted by some court, and you get creative judges. And sometimes what they do is very sensible. The Americans have the American Constitution, which was written in the 18th century. It's still there. The consequences have changed dramatically because of the Supreme Court. Now, we're not in that territory, but it has done such damage to the ability of the British government and British Parliament to have the last word on our particular problem of illegal migration. That's why it needs to be dealt with. And part of the responsibility is Tony Blair's, because he introduced the policy of incorporating any judgments of the European Court into domestic British law automatically, without Parliament being invited to decide.
What do you think then? Because you said you prefer a sort of more temporary climb down on part of it rather than...
Not a climb down, a suspension of its enforcement in the UK.
But how do you feel then about Kemi Badenoch's promise that essentially would be repealed in full?
Well, a lot of people have been calling for that, and I can see the reason why they're doing so. All I'm really saying is I don't think you need to go that far. There is something slightly distasteful about being one of the very few, if not the only, European democratic country that withdraws from the European Convention of Human Rights. That's not what Britain's normally about, and it will make a lot of people unhappy. I think but it's not the whole convention we're concerned with. The real drama is its implication for illegal migrants being able to be removed from this country if that is deemed to be in accordance with UK law. And as long as we can do that, the least damage we do to our relationship with the European Convention, the better.
Yeah. This has clearly become a huge political issue, and even Labour, which might be seen as a party particularly
Jack
reluctant.
Straw said something similar, for example.
Right. I was thinking of Shabana Mahmood, the new Home Secretary, who's not saying she'd go even as far as you're suggesting, but that she does want much tougher rules to try and deal with this challenge.
We have received an excellent tonic by her appointment. I don't know the lady, but I'm, like many people, already very impressed. It's partly because, in addition to being a very tough minister who knows what she wants to do, she's a barrister. She's a lawyer. She can meet legal arguments from a lawyer's point of view and tell them where the law is not saying what they are claiming it should say. Edmund Burke once famously said that he had no objection to being governed by law, but he did occasionally object to being governed by lawyers.
Yes, people
There's some relevance to that today.
Sometimes worry that there are too many lawyers in the House of Commons, but perhaps we need...
There never could be too many lawyers, says one of them.
Do you think that the Rwanda scheme, which obviously was part of the sort of previous Conservative government's efforts to deal with the problem of the small boats, which Labour didn't take forward and struggled in various ways to get through the courts. Do you think that was an answer, or should have been part of the?
I always thought, even at the time, that it was a great political mistake, and the mistake was choosing Rwanda. This is the first time something of that kind was going to be done by a British government, to choose a country in Central Africa run by a very impressive president, but who also happens to be a dictator, who does not respect human rights in the way that we would expect in Rwanda itself. For that to be, as it were, the best country we could choose, I thought that was, in political terms and in terms of public policy, very unwise.
Let's move on to a different topic about foreign affairs, which is the war in Ukraine.
Yes.
Now, as we speak, Vladimir Putin and the US envoy Steve Witkoff are in talks. They're trying to take forward this plan for a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. How do you think the war is going to end? Well,
I know Ukraine quite well. I've visited the country probably at least 9 or 10 times over the years, not during the war itself, but over the years since its independence. And I am a great enthusiast and admirer of what the Ukrainians have done. It is quite remarkable how they still control over 80% of their territory. Now, we just do not know at this moment exactly what is in the revised agreement that Trump and Zelensky say they can both live with. And that's what Mr. Witkoff, we presume, is putting to Mr. Putin. On all the evidence we have, it's going to be rejected. It would be astonishing if it wasn't, because it goes flat in the face not only of what Putin wants, but what he thought he'd persuaded Trump to agree to.
Do you think Trump's misread Putin, that he thought he could trust him?
I think the problem, and I'm able, because I'm not in Parliament, I'm not in the government, I can say what I actually think. I think the problem with Mr. Trump is not, I don't think he's hostile to Ukraine and its interests. And dare I say it, I think he's indifferent. He is more concerned to be the president who brought this war to an end, even if it's only by a temporary ceasefire. That would be a great achievement. I don't question that for a moment. But I think that's what motivates him. And so if you're trying to do proper diplomacy to get a resolution that is acceptable, both not just to the aggressor, but to the country that has been aggressed by that aggressor, you do not, first of all, send what is no doubt a very highly intelligent property magnate called Mr. Witkoff, who has no diplomatic background, who does not understand the history of either Russia or Ukraine. That's become obvious from some of the remarks that he has made. So that was a big mistake in the first place. Secondly, you don't go into that kind of discussion until you, the American president, have already discussed with the Ukrainian president, however privately, without any publication of compromises that might be available. That's what you do first. And then you send either your Secretary of State or whoever it might be to do the discussion. So Trump's approach is very, very bad. So rather like when Nixon opened to China, he didn't send a property magnate, he sent Henry Kissinger. And that might be why it worked.
Yes. It seems that one of the sticking points is about ceding territory. The Russians seem to want Ukraine to hand over territory, and that's that they haven't yet conquered, and that's very difficult for Zelensky to do, understandably. If this isn't where the war ends, do you see an end in sight? What might a resolution that's realistic look like?
First of all, it cannot be, not just for Mr. Trump, but for me or for anyone in the West, to tell Zelensky what the concessions and compromises he should accept might be. It's his country. He and his people and his parliament, and they are a democracy. They have an elected parliament, they are an elected government, and they are entitled to have the right to decide what concessions. Now, my guess is, it's more than a guess, it's based on what Zelensky has said over the last 3 years, is that the Ukrainians are not stupid, they're not unrealistic. They know perfectly well that for the foreseeable future, they cannot recover Crimea. They probably cannot recover the other territories occupied since the war began 3 years ago, because they simply do not have that military capability. What they will insist on, I'm sure, is we may have to accept de facto the reality that's going to remain under Russian control, but we will never accept Russia's right to have those territories. Now, there's a very good precedent for that. When Stalin invaded the Baltic states during the Second World War and annexed them, Britain, the British government, never until the Baltic states were liberated, recognized the legitimacy of what the Soviet Union had done. So I think there will be concessions available from the Ukrainian government. They know perfectly well they're not going to be in NATO in the foreseeable future. That is not a big deal for them. They would like to be, but they know that NATO is not even united in wishing to invite them. So we'll have to see how that works out.
The UK obviously did a great deal in the early days of the war to stand up for Ukraine, yes, and since. And part of Trump's concerns is about the US in taking too much responsibility or too much spending and wants Europe to do more. Do you think there's more that the UK could be doing now?
First of all, may I say this, that I'm no admirer of Keir Starmer, but I do acknowledge that on this particular issue, he's played the British position extremely well, because whatever your views on Brexit might be, Brexit was nothing to do with defence or national security. The European Union doesn't have responsibility for armies and issues of peace and war. So he has been part of a triumvirate of Britain, France and Germany. And not only the Ukrainians, but the French and Germans as well, recognise the UK has taken the lead. And to be fair, again, I'm no admirer of Boris Johnson, to be honest, but he also was on Ukraine, first class. So the UK does have a very special authority within Ukraine. President Zelensky and his colleagues are very careful to listen and discuss issues with the UK government as well as other governments. And that's something we can build on.
Some see this conflict in Ukraine as really just sort of one stage of Russia's potentially larger ambitions in the east of Europe, particularly around Poland, for example. When the Conservatives were still in power last January, Grant Shapps, as Defence Secretary, came out and said, "We are moving from a post-war world to a pre-war one." Do you think that's still true?
I know what they're saying. Yes. In one sense, of course, they are correct. But I think we have to be a bit careful about the language we use. Because if you're saying, we're back to the Cold War, or this could be leading to a third world war, or something of that kind, nobody can say that couldn't happen. But do remember there's a fundamental difference between where Putin is today and where Brezhnev was in 1984. I was a junior minister in the Foreign Office. That was my first Foreign Office appointment. And I had responsibility under Geoffrey Howe for our relations with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So I visited these countries in the 1980s during the Cold War, the height of the Cold War. And at that time, if that Cold War had become a hot war, Soviet troops, where would they have begun? They would have begun in Berlin, because they were already there. The whole of Eastern Europe was occupied in one form or another by the Soviet armed forces and by the Soviet government. They had communism imposed upon them, and that included a third of Germany. So the war would have begun in Germany, close to France. If Putin ever was stupid enough to think he can take on NATO, which I don't think he is that stupid, he wouldn't start in Berlin. He would start 1,000 miles further east, just outside a place called St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea. Now, the military task, if he's taken 3 years and the Ukrainians still control 82% of the territory, he can't defeat NATO. But that does not mean we are not facing a real and serious threat, because the Baltic states would be a target of his, as would Moldova, as might be parts of Poland. And he might very well, if either NATO was divided because the Americans were across the Atlantic or too busy in the Pacific, or if the Europeans couldn't get their act together, or if our armed forces and our defence budgets were not increased substantially over the next 3 years, then what we could expect, particularly if Putin was to have a successful outcome to the Ukraine war in terms of grabbing territory, his ambitions would certainly not stop there. So he would try to... He made a speech some years ago, and it's the best way of understanding Putin. He said, the greatest disaster of my life, and he didn't say it was the end of communism or the end of the Cold War. He said it was the end of the Soviet Union, by which he meant the Russian Empire. Because as we all know, the Soviet Union imploded. Not because of NATO, that wasn't NATO's idea. It was Boris Yeltsin and his colleagues decided all these other parts of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, were an expensive handicap and should be allowed to go their own way. That's what Putin cannot stomach. And that is what motivates not only his ambition for Ukraine, but if he was to succeed there, his ambition for these other countries that are now free and enjoying democracy and the rule of law, particularly the Baltic states, but also Georgia and other countries of that kind.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting, and thank you. And you mentioned this in part just before we move on to another topic, but some might say in response to that, well, this is all happening far away in countries of which we know little.
Who first used that phrase? I think it was a chap called Chamberlain, wasn't it?
Might it be that we don't actually need to spend all this money that people are talking about on defence in the UK? You think we still do?
No, because remember, I don't normally quote Frederick the Great, who was not exactly known as a great peacemaker, but he made one marvellous remark that I've noted and occasionally remember. He said, "Diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments." Now, if you have arms, it doesn't mean you want to use them or you're going to go to war. It means when there's a huge international difference of view, which requires delicate negotiations, which could lead to war if the diplomacy fails, your power to achieve a diplomatic solution with a potential aggressor is hugely greater if your opponent knows that if diplomacy fails, you are sufficiently well armed, not just to protect yourself, but to defeat your enemy. That's what diplomacy is all about, and that's what deterrence is all about. So that's the kind of situation we're in. We are going to, if Putin continues, or somebody like Putin takes over from him, and we're faced with a Russia that is aggressive over the next generation, we must have armed forces that are not as weak as they were over the last 25 years. Now, they were weak in Russia. All the countries at the end of the Cold War dramatically reduced their defense budgets. Putin started increasing his when he decided to go to war with Ukraine and other actions of that kind. He has increased them dramatically so that it's something like 11% of his government expenditure. We're struggling to meet 3.5%, 4%. That's not good enough. And final point on that, of course, you can't just take a decision to increase your expenditure and then have far stronger armed forces a month later. It actually takes, most of the experts say, about 2 or 3 years. So in that respect, Mr. Trump has done us a good favor by bullying the Europeans to increase their defense spending now. In 2 or 3 years' time, we'll have got somewhere we wouldn't have been otherwise.
Thank you. Let's move it back to the home front and talk about domestic policies and the Conservative Party. You have obviously tremendous experience over your career, one of the few ministers, I think, to serve continuously throughout the Thatcher.
Ken Clarke and I and 2 others, you have to go back to, this is for uninterrupted ministerial office. Churchill was a minister more years, but to go back to uninterrupted 18 years, you have to go back to Lord Palmerston in 1820. So how about that? We didn't know that. We were told that by the chief whip when we broke the record.
Well, the question is, I suppose, when is the next opportunity for people to have a Conservative ministerial post?
Well, I hope it's not 18 years.
Yeah. Well, this week, the latest YouGov poll, it's out today, shows perhaps good news for the Conservatives. For the first time since the election, they are neck and neck with Labour. But the problem is that they're both on 19%, while Reform UK is on 26%. And this week as well, a former deputy chair of the Conservative Party, Jonathan Gullis, has gone to Reform along with a couple of former Conservative MPs. Does the Conservative Party still have a future?
Well, yes, we do have a future. And because we've had a very, very long past. The Conservative Party is the oldest political party in the world. It goes back to the 1700s. Before Republicans and Democrats were created in the United States or similar parties in any other country. Why is that? It's because we don't have an ideology. If you have an ideology like communism or fascism or socialism, it has its day. It's found not to be able to deliver. And then the parties that speak for it disappear or have to change themselves. There's never been a conservative ideology. There are conservative values, principles. One of the best remarks that was made to describe why the Conservative Party is so relevant was a quote from a novel people may have heard of, The Leopard, about Sicily in the 19th century, where somebody says to an Italian nobleman, if you want things to stay the same, things will have to change. So the Conservative Party has never been reactionary. It has wanted to learn from the past. It's been prepared to change when society is changing. Now, to take up your particular point, what I've been feeling, and this may be wishful thinking, but I'm not surprised by what you said about the improvement in the polls, for 2 reasons. I think, first of all, Kemi Badenoch is now beginning to appear like a strong, articulate, and credible leader. Still got quite some way to go, but Margaret Thatcher was in that position when she first became leader of the opposition, so there's a precedent there. But the second point, which is much more relevant even than the leadership, is that the Labour Party's budget which we've just had, in the eyes of the public, correctly, marks the Labour Party no longer Blair's New Labour. It is now high tax, high spend, as a party proud of it, seeking to use that to justify its behaviour. That means the Tory party, the Conservative Party, now is equally able and very willing to be seen as the party that would cut taxes as soon as it was able to do so. That would be its priority, not just an option. Now, that gives a good reason for people who are completely fed up with the last Conservative government, for whatever reasons, to start saying, right, we're into new territory now. That was a couple of years ago. Very few people are, I think, enthusiastic about the Farage option. Farage has got influence on one issue only, and he's got real influence on the issue of migration, if that's not brought under illegal migration, if that's not brought under control. But on economic issues, on tax, he's got nothing to say. And we know that. And apart from Farage, there's no one else in his party most people have even heard of. So I'm not saying he's not a threat. I'm saying the Conservative Party now has an opportunity, and your reference to the opinion polls suggests that this may now be happening, where the Labour and Conservative parties begin to appeal to their own base support. Labour will have recovered some traditional Labour voters by the budget, particularly from very low-income families. The Conservatives can now present themselves credibly as the only serious low-tax party. And that, I think, will be the beginning of the recovery. But it will take years, not weeks or months, to fully realise itself.
What do you think? Because part of the problem, of course, is a loss of trust with the past and the last 14 years of Conservative government, in which I think even Kemi Badenoch has had to say, look, there were mistakes, there were things we did wrong.
Well, may I interrupt? I mean, I think you're right, but I think it wasn't so much 14 years. I think it was the chaos of the Boris Johnson and Liz Truss period in office. I think it destroyed the reputation and credibility of the Conservative Party as being an efficient and sensible party of government. It was too reckless. In different ways. They weren't the same people, they were different people. But we know what I'm referring to.
Yes, but I mean, I was thinking about what you were saying about not having an ideology. Perhaps one of the challenges the Conservatives have had over that period is there were a lot of different flavours of them. And that is a strength, potentially, but it sort of went from Liz Truss, which was perhaps, very, very sort of strongly free market, although with extreme sort of energy price subsidies at the same time. Theresa May as well, who was more sort of social democratic. Boris Johnson, who was trying to build a new coalition with the Red Wall and sort of doing things to do with levelling up. David Cameron, who was perhaps trying to be the heir to Blair. That all rather different sides of conservatism, and how is it going to settle on a new brand?
It's a good question, and I think part of the answer, let's go back to Margaret Thatcher's success.
Yes.
There's a lot of luck in politics. It's when leaders come to a position of either actual power or potential power, and the country knows what the country needs. That happened with Churchill in 1940, who would not otherwise have become Prime Minister. It needed the winter of discontent and the shambles of the Labour Callaghan government to make people feel that the trade unions were too powerful and we needed low taxation and so forth. Now, that historic episode, we may, and I can't be 100% certain that what I say is correct, but I think we are approaching a situation. It goes back to what I said a few moments ago, really, when the economic issue, the standard of living of people not very rich, not very poor, that's easy to understand, but the very large numbers in between, called either middle class or people on modest incomes, they are in my judgment, are no longer going to be impressed by we have to put your taxes up because we have to spend more on welfare services. And we haven't got time to go into the detail of that, but I think that offers territory which is no man's land at the moment. The Conservatives can occupy one side of that territory while the Labour government, incredibly unpopular for a government only in power for a year or so, has to defend its abandonment not just of low tax, but of all that the Blair New Labour adventure successfully created at that time.
I suppose the challenge is the populist wings around that. The Conservatives will have Reform UK. to the extent that that's still a party.
Populist, not necessarily popular.
Yes, but let's say offering easy economic answers. The next election might be fought on economic questions, but if you had Zach Polanski on the left and whatever Jeremy Corbyn's Your Party turns into, both saying, well, look, we're just going to tax these very rich people, hit the wealthy, that'll sort it all out, which we know it won't, but yeah, they can offer that. It's popular with a certain demographic. Reform on the right, if they want to, chasing their new set of voters and offering, we're going to privatise this, we're going to make all these cuts, don't worry, we can save loads of money. Easy economic answers could be popular, even if they don't work.
I know what you're getting at, and there are a lot of people who like to do that because they come from what you called the populist right or the populist left. But they may be running out of options. I mean, you said that the populist right may want to offer privatization. There's not actually much left to privatize, if the truth be told, because I was part of the government. It wasn't me, but Margaret Thatcher's government and John Major's privatized most of what needed to be privatized. One exception, obviously, the railways is the exception at this precise moment. But there's not much left to privatize. It's actually about tax. And it's about how much people who have worked hard and have earned their salaries or their income, how much they're permitted to keep and how much goes to the government. Now, that is something which the whole country can identify with. They won't all want to vote Conservative. I am well aware of that. The question I think that we were discussing a few moments ago is how does the Conservative Party get back to being a credible alternative government, which it certainly isn't at this precise moment. But it can get that. It can get to that position by the next general election. Whether they could win the general election is another matter because of the sheer size of the gap. It may take 2 terms.
One of the problems the party's had in recent years is in its sort of pragmatism, it's quite good at regicide and perhaps too quick to get rid of leaders. There is a danger that Kemi Badenoch won't survive the May local elections when the Conservative results are likely to be bad, however much she improves things in the polls.
They may be too ready to get rid of leaders who are deemed to have failed. I think when Mrs. Truss was dispatched in 46 days, I think the public interest was very well served and the Conservative Party's interest was well served. Her successor was Rishi Sunak. It wasn't Rishi who created the ghastly result of the general election. If Truss hadn't been there and if Johnson had either behaved differently or had not been there, we might have still been defeated after 14 years, but not remotely by the vastness of the defeat.
But there is a strong contingent who don't like Kemi Badenoch as a leader, are suspicious of her ability to succeed.
Some people didn't like Margaret Thatcher.
Yes.
You know, and I wasn't a Thatcher. I must be honest, I wasn't a Thatcher. I voted for her when she became leader, but I voted for her because I watched her in the House of Commons when she was battling with the Labour Party during that short period after Ted Heath had resigned. And I thought, good Lord, she's a real fighter and she was articulate. And I was rather tickled by the idea that the so-called boring old Conservative Party would be the first in the Western world to have a woman Prime Minister if we succeeded. Yeah. And I never regretted that. So I had differences with Margaret Thatcher when I was in her cabinet, sometimes quite serious problems. But I admired her enormously. I think after Churchill, she and Churchill are the two icons, the two heroes of post-war British politics, with Blair coming third, I have to concede.
Malcolm Rifkind, thank you very much.